During the flood, a boy saved an elderly man from drowning without a second thought. The next morning, a black limousine stopped in front of his house, and when he saw who stepped out of the car, his heart started racing. The rain was relentless. Damien stood at the front door, staring out into the streets of his neighborhood. Water rushed past the small wooden gate, carrying trash cans, branches, and whatever else had gotten caught in the flood's path. The distant sounds of people yelling and dogs barking made the scene even more chaotic. Damien's hands tightened around the doorframe, his knuckles turning white. The memories of the last flood came rushing back to him, the images of his grandmother struggling in the rising waters, and the helplessness he felt. "Damien," his mother shouted from the kitchen, "get the plastic bags and help me lift these things off the floor." Her voice was sharp, full of stress. Damien turned back into the house. The small living room was a mess, filled with furniture dragged from the kitchen. His mom was bent over, hurriedly packing what she could in garbage bags. He could hear his dad struggling to lift the old TV onto the table. "Coming, Mom," Damien said, running to grab the bags. The rain pounding on the metal roof was deafening. Damien's father grunted as he moved, his back still not fully recovered from the injury a few months ago. They had no time to lose. Water was already seeping in through the edges of the door. Damien could feel the tension between his parents. They had been through this before, but things were different now. There was barely enough money as it was. Suddenly, something caught Damien's eye. Through the window, he saw a figure stumbling, struggling against the current. Damien squinted through the downpour. It was Mr. Hargrove, the old man who lived a couple of houses down. He was flailing, trying to hold on to a lamppost. Water was already chest-high on him. "Mom!" Damien shouted, dropping the bags. "It's Mr. Hargrove. He's outside." He ran to the door, yanking it open. "Damien, no!" his mother yelled, her voice edged with panic. "Don't you dare! Get back here!" Damien's feet were already moving. He could barely hear his mother over the roaring flood, the sound of water splashing all around. His heart pounded, both with fear and adrenaline. He knew Mr. Hargrove had no chance if no one helped him. The cold water hit Damien's legs as he rushed out, soaking his jeans and pulling at him with a force that almost knocked him off balance. He took a breath and forced himself forward, step by step, towards the old man. His muscles tensed, and his teeth were chattering. He could hear Mr. Hargrove calling for help, his voice cracking. "Mr. Hargrove," Damien shouted, his voice straining against the noise. "I'm coming. Hang on." Mr. Hargrove turned his head, his eyes wide with fear. Damien reached out as he pushed through the water, every movement a struggle against the current, trying to drag him under. He finally reached the post where Mr. Hargrove clung, his fingers white from gripping so tightly. "Damien, son, get out of here," Mr. Hargrove wheezed, his voice trembling. "No way," Damien said. He wrapped his arm around Mr. Hargrove's shoulder. "I'm not leaving you here. We need to get to higher ground." Damien pulled, but the weight of the water made every movement difficult. The current tugged at them both, and his footing slipped on something underneath. They nearly fell, water splashing over their heads, but Damien gritted his teeth and steadied himself. Mr. Hargrove was too tired, barely managing to stand. Damien felt the water get stronger, and panic started to rise. "You have to help me, Mr. Hargrove," Damien shouted, his voice urgent. "We need to move now." Mr. Hargrove nodded weakly, and Damien started to guide him, pushing forward. Each step felt like a battle. The cold was numbing his legs, making his muscles ache. The rain kept pouring, and the water level kept rising. They slipped, but Damien managed to pull Mr. Hargrove up again, his breaths coming in quick, sharp gasps. "Almost there," Damien muttered, more to himself than to Mr. Hargrove. He could see his neighbors, finally noticing them, rushing out from a nearby house. Damien waved his arm, signaling for help. "Over here!" he yelled. Two men rushed over, splashing through the water to reach them. They grabbed Mr. Hargrove from Damien's grip, helping him up the steps to a nearby porch. Damien followed, his whole body feeling weak. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind exhaustion. He collapsed onto the steps, his chest heaving. "Thank you, son," Mr. Hargrove said, his voice barely audible, but Damien just nodded. He couldn't speak, couldn't even think. He was just glad Mr. Hargrove was safe. His mom's voice echoed in his head, her warning to stay inside. Damien swallowed, dreading the look she would give him when he returned home. But he couldn't think about that right now. Right now, all that mattered was that they were alive. Damien slowly got to his feet. The rain was still falling, but he could hear the shouts of people, see others helping each other out of the water. He turned towards his house, his steps heavy as he walked back. When he reached the door, his mother was waiting. Her face was pale, her hands shaking as she grabbed him by the shoulders. "Damien," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" Damien opened his mouth to answer, but before he could, she pulled him into a tight hug. He could feel her trembling. She pulled away just as quickly, her expression changing to one of anger. "Don't you ever scare me like that again," she snapped, her eyes watering. "Do you hear me?" "I'm sorry, Mom," Damien said, his voice barely audible. He looked down, his body aching from the ordeal. "I had to help him." His mother sighed, wiping her eyes. "You're lucky you're okay. Now get inside. We need to get everything packed up before the water gets worse." Damien nodded, stepping into the house. His father glanced at him, his face tired but relieved. Damien didn't say anything. He just grabbed a bag and started helping again. The rain kept pouring outside, but for now, they were together, and they were safe. That was all that mattered. Damien felt the cold sting of the rain against his skin as he stood in the dimly lit kitchen, wringing out his wet clothes. The water had soaked through his jeans and shirt, chilling him to the bone. His mom moved around the kitchen, her face still marked with worry, trying to organize the scattered mess of supplies they had managed to save. His dad sat by the table, holding his back with a grimace of pain. There wasn't much time to relax. The flood was still worsening, and everything felt fragile, ready to shatter at any moment. "Damien, help your dad with those chairs," his mom ordered, her tone clipped. She avoided meeting his eyes, as if she was too angry or too scared to look at him. Damien nodded and moved to his dad's side, lifting one of the heavy wooden chairs onto the table. He kept glancing out of the window. The water outside was still rising. He tried to focus on his breathing, but it felt too fast, still caught in the rush from earlier. He had saved Mr. Hargrove, but he couldn't shake the feeling of how close they had come to being swept away. Suddenly, Damien heard a loud crash from the living room. He turned quickly, seeing that the front door had burst open, water rushing into the house in a violent wave. "Mom!" Damien yelled. The water came in fast, sloshing across the floor, sweeping over their feet. His mom was there in an instant, trying to push the door closed, but the pressure of the floodwater made it impossible. Damien ran to help, bracing his shoulder against the door. "We need something to block it," his dad shouted from behind them, his voice strained. Damien's mom pointed towards a piece of plywood propped against the wall near the kitchen. "Get that, Damien!" she yelled, her voice trembling with urgency. Damien scrambled towards it, the water slowing his movements, making each step a struggle. He grabbed the plywood and dragged it back to the door. Together they managed to wedge it against the frame, creating a shaky barrier against the water. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to do. Damien's heart was pounding again, that sense of helplessness creeping back in. The flood wasn't stopping. No matter how hard they tried, it seemed like they were just delaying the inevitable. "We need to get out of here," his father said, his face pale. He looked at Damien's mom, his eyes full of concern. "We need to move to higher ground. We can't stay here." Damien's mom looked around, her eyes scanning the house that had been their home for so many years. She nodded, swallowing hard. "All right, let's get what we can carry. We'll go to the neighbor's place, see if they're still taking people in." Damien moved quickly, grabbing a bag and stuffing it with whatever he could reach: clothes, canned food, anything that might be useful. His mom did the same, her hands shaking as she packed. His dad was slower, his injured back making each movement a struggle. As they worked, Damien heard something outside. A noise, faint at first but growing louder. He paused, trying to listen. It was a voice, someone calling out for help. "Did you hear that?" Damien asked, turning towards his mom. She stopped, her face tense. "No, Damien. We're not going out there again. We're leaving. Now." "But Mom," Damien started, but she cut him off with a sharp look. "No," she said, her voice breaking. "You almost died out there. I'm not losing you, Damien." Damien clenched his jaw, his eyes flicking towards the door. He could still hear the voice, faint and desperate. Someone was out there, struggling, just like Mr. Hargrove had been. "We have to go," his father said, his voice tired but firm. He placed a hand on Damien's shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. "We can't save everyone, son." Damien nodded, but his stomach twisted. He knew they were right, but it didn't make it any easier. He turned away, focusing on the task at hand, trying to push the voice out of his mind. They had to think about themselves now, about staying alive. Once they were ready, Damien's mom opened the back door. The water was already ankle-deep in the kitchen, and stepping outside felt like stepping into a river. Damien held tightly onto the bag slung over his shoulder, his mom and dad right behind him. The rain was still coming down hard, and the current was strong, pushing against Damien's legs, making every step feel like a fight. They moved slowly, carefully, each of them holding onto the other for support. Damien's dad grimaced in pain as they walked, his movements slow, but he pushed on, determined. "Keep moving," his mom urged, her eyes scanning the dark, flooded street. "We're almost there." They reached the neighbor's house, a 2-story building that still stood above the water. People were huddled on the porch, their faces pale and weary. One of them, a middle-aged woman with short graying hair, waved them over. Come on," she called, her voice barely audible over the storm. Damien's mom nodded, urging Damien and his dad forward. They waded through the water, climbing up the steps onto the porch. The woman helped Damien's dad up, her hands steady and strong. "Thank you," Damien's mom said, her voice thick with emotion. "We didn't know where else to go." The woman nodded. "You're safe here. We're all just trying to make it through this." She glanced at Damien, her eyes lingering on him for a moment. "You're the one who helped old Mr. Hargrove, aren't you?" Damien looked down, nodding. "Yeah, he needed help." The woman smiled, a tired but genuine smile. "You did good, kid. Not many people would have done what you did." Damien didn't know what to say. He just nodded again, feeling a mix of pride and exhaustion. He glanced at his mom, her face a mixture of relief and worry. She reached out, pulling him into a hug, her arms tight around him. "I'm proud of you, Damien," she whispered. "But please, just stay safe. We need you too." Damien swallowed, his throat tight. "I will, Mom," he said, his voice barely audible. They sat down on the porch, the rain still pounding, the water still rising. They were safe for now, but Damien knew this wasn't over. The flood was still raging, and the night was far from done. They had made it through one battle, but there were more to come. And Damien knew, deep down, that he would do whatever it took to keep his family safe, no matter what. Morning came slowly, with a gray sky, and the rain still falling, though softer now. Damien's body ached, his muscles sore from the struggle the night before. He blinked, taking in his surroundings on the neighbor's porch, where they had managed to sleep for a few hours. His mother and father were still asleep, leaning against the wooden railing, exhaustion etched into their faces. Damien stood up, stretching his stiff back, and looked out at what used to be their street. The water had receded slightly, but it was still high, and debris floated aimlessly, everything from branches to pieces of people's lives. Damien watched as a child's toy truck bobbed in the murky water, spinning slowly in the current. The town looked broken, battered, and Damien felt that same feeling creeping back. Helplessness. The sounds of people moving around began to pick up. Damien could see a few neighbors stepping carefully into the water, starting to check on what was left of their homes. He turned to his parents. His mom was awake now, rubbing her eyes and looking around. "Morning, Mom," Damien said quietly. His mother nodded, her expression distant. She looked towards the water and then at Damien. "We need to check on the house, see if we can salvage anything." His father groaned as he stood up, his hand immediately going to his back. Damien could see the pain on his dad's face, how every movement seemed to hurt. But there was no other option. They had to see what was left. The three of them made their way back to their house, carefully stepping through the water. It was lower now, only calf deep, but it was enough to leave mud and destruction behind. Damien felt his heart sink as they approached the door. The plywood they had used to block the water had been pushed in. The door hung loosely on its hinges. His mom let out a sigh, her shoulders slumping. She pushed the door open, and they stepped inside. The floor was covered in mud, and the furniture they hadn't managed to move was tipped over, soaked and ruined. Damien walked slowly through the room, his feet squelching with each step. "Everything's ruined," his dad said quietly, his voice full of defeat. He looked around, taking in the destruction. The workshop. Damien's heart clenched. The workshop. His dad's small repair business was their main source of income. Without it, they had nothing. Damien hurried to the back of the house, pushing open the door to the workshop. He could feel his breath catch in his chest as he saw the damage. Tools lay scattered, some of them submerged in water, others broken. The workbench was soaked, the wood warped. Damien stepped inside, picking up a wrench and turning it over in his hands. The weight of it felt different now, heavier, as if it was a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. His dad stood in the doorway, his face pale. "We'll figure it out," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Damien could see the pain in his eyes, the fear of what came next. "Dad, we can fix this," Damien said, trying to sound hopeful, even if he didn't feel it. He put the wrench back down and turned to his father. "We'll clean everything up. We'll make it work." His dad gave him a small smile, but it was strained. "Yeah, son, we'll try." They spent the next few hours working in silence. Damien and his dad cleared out the workshop, salvaging whatever tools they could. His mom focused on the kitchen, trying to clean up the mess and save what little food they had left. It was exhausting work, and the silence between them made it even harder. As the sun climbed higher, the neighbors began to gather outside. Damien heard someone calling his name, and he looked up to see Mrs. Turner, a woman who lived 2 houses down, waving at him. "Damien!" she called, her voice carrying over the sound of the water. "You've got to come see this." Damien frowned, glancing at his mom. She nodded, giving him permission. He put down the broken saw he had been holding and walked over to Mrs. Turner. "What is it?" Damien asked, his curiosity piqued. She pointed down the street, her face a mixture of concern and disbelief. "There's a car, a black car. It's parked right by your house." Damien's stomach dropped. A black car. What was it doing here? He walked quickly, his feet splashing through the muddy water, until he reached the front of the house. There, parked on what was left of their street, was a sleek black limousine. It looked completely out of place among the ruins of their neighborhood, its shiny exterior untouched by the chaos around it. The door opened, and a man in a suit stepped out. He was older, with gray hair and a stern face. Damien's heart pounded as the man looked around, his eyes finally landing on Damien. He started walking towards him. Damien felt frozen. Who was this guy? What did he want? "Are you Damien?" the man asked as he approached, his voice calm, almost formal. Damien swallowed, his mouth dry. "Yeah, that's me." The man gave a small nod, as if confirming something to himself. "I'm here because of my father, Mr. Hargrove. You saved his life last night." Damien blinked, caught off guard. He hadn't expected this. He glanced back towards his house, seeing his parents watching from the doorway, their faces tense. Yeah," Damien stammered. I saw he needed help." The man smiled, and it was a strange thing, almost too kind for such a serious-looking person. "My name is Richard Hargrove. My father told me what you did. He said that without you, he wouldn't be here right now." Richard paused, his gaze softening. "I came to thank you, personally." Damien shifted on his feet, uncomfortable with the attention. "I was just doing what anyone would do." Richard shook his head. "Not everyone would have done what you did, especially not at your age. You showed incredible bravery." Damien didn't know what to say. He just nodded, feeling his cheeks flush. He could feel the eyes of the neighbors on him, everyone curious about the strange car and the well-dressed man in their rundown street. "There's something else," Richard said, reaching into his coat pocket. He pulled out a card and handed it to Damien. "My father and we want to help you. If there's anything you need, anything at all, you call me. We'd like to do something for you and your family." Damien took the card, his fingers trembling slightly. He looked at it, a simple business card with a name, a number, and a logo he didn't recognize. He glanced up at Richard, unsure of what to say. Thank you," Damien managed. "But we're okay. We don't need charity." Richard smiled again, but this time there was a hint of understanding in his eyes. "It's not charity, Damien. It's gratitude. And sometimes it's okay to accept help when it's offered." Damien looked down at the card again, then back at Richard. He nodded slowly. "I'll think about it." Richard reached out and patted Damien's shoulder. "You do that. And remember, we're here if you need us." With that, Richard turned and walked back to the car, the driver opening the door for him. Damien watched as the limousine pulled away, disappearing down the flooded street. He stood there for a moment, the card still in his hand, feeling a strange mix of emotions: relief, confusion, hope. He turned back towards his parents, who were watching him with wide eyes. His mom stepped forward, her expression full of questions. "What was that about, Damien?" she asked, her voice low. Damien held up the card. "Mr. Hargrove's son. He said they want to help us." His mom frowned, her eyes narrowing. "Help us how?" "I don't know," Damien admitted. He looked at the card again. "But he said I could call if we needed anything." His dad stepped closer, his eyes on the card. "Maybe we should think about it. We could use all the help we can get right now." Damien nodded. He knew his dad was right. The workshop was destroyed, their home in ruins. Maybe, just maybe, this could be the break they needed. "All right," Damien said, slipping the card into his pocket. "We'll see what happens." His mom nodded, though her eyes were still full of doubt. "Just be careful, Damien. We don't know these people." "I will, Mom," Damien promised. They turned back towards the house, ready to continue the daunting task of cleaning up. The day was far from over, and the challenges were only beginning. But for the first time in a long while, Damien felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe things could get better. Maybe they could find a way through this. The next day dawned a little brighter. The rain had finally stopped, and the sun peeked out from behind the clouds, sending rays of light down onto the flooded streets. The neighborhood was still a mess, with debris everywhere, but there was something about the sun that gave people hope. It made them believe that maybe, just maybe, they could start picking up the pieces. Damien sat on the porch, the morning sun warming his face. He turned the business card over in his hand, staring at the name. Richard Hargrove. Below that, a number. Damien didn't know if he should call. His parents were inside, talking in hushed voices, trying to decide what to do next. His dad's back was still bothering him, and his mom was worried sick about money, about food, about everything. Damien knew they needed help, but the thought of taking something from a stranger, even if that stranger was thankful, made him uneasy. Suddenly, the deep rumble of an engine broke the silence of the morning. Damien looked up to see the black limousine from yesterday slowly pulling up in front of his house again. He stood up, his heart starting to race. He heard the front door open behind him, his mom stepping out onto the porch, her face filled with concern. The car door opened, and Richard Hargrove stepped out once more, his suit looking as crisp as ever. He glanced around, his eyes landing on Damien. "Damien," Richard called, walking towards him with a friendly wave. "I hope I'm not intruding." Damien's mom stepped forward, her posture stiff. "Mr. Hargrove," she said, her voice polite but wary. "What brings you back here today?" Richard smiled warmly. "I wanted to speak with you all. I know the situation is difficult right now. I thought perhaps we could discuss how I might be of some assistance." Damien looked at his mom, her expression tight. She glanced at Damien, then nodded reluctantly. "All right. Come on in, Mr. Hargrove." They stepped back into the house, and Damien led Richard to the small kitchen table. His dad was already seated there, his face creased with fatigue. Damien pulled out a chair for Richard, who sat down and looked at them all with a serious expression. "First of all," Richard began, his voice calm, "I want you to understand that this isn't charity. What Damien did for my father was something extraordinary. He risked his own life to save him, and I will forever be grateful. I know times are tough, and I want to help in any way I can." Damien's mom folded her arms across her chest. "We appreciate the offer, Mr. Hargrove, but we're not comfortable with just accepting handouts. We've always managed on our own." Richard nodded. "I understand completely, but this is more than just an offer of money or supplies." He paused, then pulled out a small envelope from his jacket and placed it on the table. "What I'm proposing is an opportunity." Damien looked at the envelope, then at Richard, confused. "What do you mean?" Richard smiled. "Inside that envelope is a letter of recommendation for you, Damien. My family has connections to a private school in the city, a school that could offer you opportunities that you won't find here." He glanced at Damien's parents, then back at Damien. "It's a full scholarship, tuition, books, even a small stipend for transportation. I want to give you the chance to study, to learn, and to build a future that might be out of reach otherwise." Damien's mom sucked in a breath, her eyes wide. She looked at Damien, then at her husband, who was staring at the envelope, his brow furrowed. "Why?" Damien asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you do this for me?" Richard's gaze softened. "Because you saved my father's life, Damien. And I believe in giving back. I believe in helping those who show the courage and character you showed that night. You have potential, Damien. I see it, and I want to help you reach it." Damien swallowed hard, his eyes fixed on the envelope. He could feel the weight of the offer pressing down on him. He thought about the workshop, about his father's aching back, about his mom's worried face. This could be a way to help them, to make sure they didn't have to struggle forever. But it also meant leaving. It meant stepping into a world he knew nothing about. A world where he wouldn't belong, at least not at first. His mom's voice broke the silence. "And what about us?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "What happens to our family while Damien is away at some fancy school?" Richard nodded. I've also arranged for some additional support for your family. Nothing extravagant, just enough to help get the workshop back in order and to cover any immediate expenses. I want Damien to have the chance to focus on his studies without worrying about what's happening back home. Damien's dad finally spoke, his voice hoarse. You really mean this? Richard nodded. I do. I know it's a lot to take in and I don't expect an answer today, but I hope you'll consider it. Damien's mom looked at her husband, then at Damien. What do you think, Damien? She asked, her voice soft. Damien took a deep breath. He could feel everyone's eyes on him, waiting for his response. He thought about Mr. Hargrove, about that night in the water, about how close they had come to losing everything. He thought about the workshop, about his dad's tired eyes, about his mom's hands shaking as she tried to clean up after the flood. I think I want to try, Damien said finally, his voice shaking slightly. I think I want to see what's possible. His mom's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, a small smile breaking through. His dad reached over, putting a hand on Damien's shoulder. We're proud of you, son. Whatever you decide, we're behind you. Richard smiled, standing up from the table. I'm glad to hear that, Damien. You're making a brave choice, and I promise you, it's going to be worth it. He handed Damien the envelope, his expression sincere. Take your time. Talk it over as a family. When you're ready, give me a call and we'll make the arrangements. Damien took the envelope, the paper feeling heavy in his hands. He nodded. Thank you, Mr. Hargrove. I really appreciate this. Richard nodded, then turned to Damien's parents. Thank you for allowing me into your home. I'll be in touch. He walked towards the door, and Damien followed him out. The sun was shining brighter now, and the streets were slowly starting to come alive again. Richard paused, turning back to Damien. You've got a bright future ahead of you, Damien. Don't be afraid to chase it. Damien nodded, watching as Richard climbed back into the limousine. The car drove away, leaving Damien standing there, the envelope clutched tightly in his hand. He turned back towards the house, his heart pounding. His mom was waiting by the door, her eyes still full of concern. Are you sure about this, Damien? She asked. It's a big change. Damien looked down at the envelope, then back up at his mom. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. I'm not sure, Mom, but I think it's worth trying. For all of us. She smiled, her eyes glistening. She reached out and pulled him into a hug. Whatever happens, we're proud of you. Always. Damien hugged her back, the fear and uncertainty still there, but mixed now with a sense of hope. Maybe this really could be the start of something better. They walked back into the house, the envelope still clutched tightly in Damien's hand. There was a lot to think about, a lot to decide. But for the first time, Damien felt like maybe they had a way forward, a chance at something more. Damien held onto the envelope for days, turning it over in his hands so often that the edges began to wear down. He could feel the pressure mounting, both from within himself and from his parents' worried glances. The flood had taken so much from them, and they were left scrambling to pick up the pieces. The workshop was a mess, the tools in various stages of rust and ruin, and Damien's dad moved slower each day, his back still hurting from the work. There was a lot riding on this decision, and Damien knew it. Finally, one afternoon, Damien took a deep breath and dialed the number on the card. His hands were trembling as he held the phone to his ear, the ringing sounding far too loud in the quiet house. His mom was in the kitchen, scrubbing dishes with a faraway look on her face, and his dad was napping in the back room. The ringing stopped, and a familiar voice answered. "This is Richard Hargrove." Damien swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. Mr. Hargrove? It's Damien." "Damien!" Richard's voice immediately softened, full of warmth. "I'm so glad you called. How are you? Have you and your family had time to discuss my offer?" Damien took a deep breath. We have. And I think I'd like to try. I want to take you up on the scholarship. There was a pause on the other end, then the sound of a smile in Richard's voice. I'm very glad to hear that, Damien. This is a big step, and I know it's not easy. You're making a brave choice. Damien nodded, though Richard couldn't see it. Yeah, I think it's what's best. For my family, too. I'll take care of all the arrangements, Richard said, his tone confident. There are just a few things we'll need to sort out. Logistics, paperwork. Would you be able to meet me in the city tomorrow? We can finalize everything. Damien hesitated. The city felt like a world away. It was so different from his small town, the kind of place he had never imagined he'd have any business in. But he pushed down his fear and nodded again. I can do that. Excellent, Richard said. I'll have a car pick you up in the morning. It's going to be all right, Damien. This is the beginning of something amazing. After they hung up, Damien took a deep breath and turned back towards the kitchen. His mom had paused, the dish towel in her hands. She gave Damien a questioning look. What did he say? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He's sending a car tomorrow, Damien said, his voice shaking slightly. I'm going to the city to finalize things. His mom nodded slowly, her expression full of a mix of pride and worry. She stepped forward, reaching up to touch Damien's face. This is a big step, Damien. I'm proud of you, but I want you to be careful. The world outside of here, it's different. There are people who might not understand you or treat you well. Damien nodded. I know, Mom, I'll be careful. She hugged him, holding him tight, and Damien closed his eyes. He could feel her heart beating against his, and for a moment, he let himself stay there, safe in her arms. Then she pulled away, giving him a small, brave smile. We'll make this work, she said. All of us. The next morning, a black car pulled up outside their house. It wasn't the limousine this time, but a sleek sedan, still completely out of place in their modest neighborhood. Damien's dad stood in the doorway, his face tight with worry, while his mom smoothed out the collar of Damien's shirt. Remember what I said, she told him, her voice steady. Be respectful, be careful, and remember who you are. No matter what happens, you're still our Damien. Damien nodded. He could see the pride in her eyes, mixed with a deep sadness that made his heart ache. He hugged his dad, who gave him a firm squeeze on the shoulder. You're going to do great, son, his dad said, his voice rough with emotion. Just keep your head on straight. Damien stepped towards the car, his heart pounding in his chest. The driver opened the door, and Damien slid inside, the leather seats cool under his hands. The door shut, and the car pulled away, the neighborhood slowly fading behind them. The ride to the city felt long. Damien watched as the landscape changed, the fields and small houses turning into highways and tall buildings. Everything seemed bigger, louder. The city seemed alive in a way that made Damien both excited and terrified. He felt small, insignificant among the towering skyscrapers and the crowds of people. The car finally pulled up in front of a tall glass building, and the driver opened Damien's door. Damien stepped out, looking up at the structure in awe. It was massive, gleaming in the morning sun. Richard was waiting for him by the entrance, his suit immaculate, his face breaking into a smile as he saw Damien. Welcome, Damien, Richard said, extending his hand. I know this must be overwhelming, but I promise you, you're in good hands. Damien shook his hand, trying to steady himself. Thanks for having me. Richard led him inside, through a lobby that felt too grand, too polished. People in suits rushed past, phones pressed to their ears, barely sparing Damien a glance. They took an elevator up to a high floor, the doors opening to reveal a large, open office space. Richard led Damien to a small room off to the side, where a woman was waiting with a stack of papers. This is the paperwork we need to finalize, Richard said, his tone gentle. "Once you sign these, everything will be official. You'll be enrolled at the school, with the scholarship covering all your needs." Damien sat down, his hands trembling as he picked up the pen. He looked at the papers, trying to read the words, but they seemed to blur together. Richard must have noticed because he put a hand on Damien's shoulder. "It's all right, Damien. Just take your time. Everything here is in your best interest, I assure you." Damien nodded, swallowing hard. He signed the papers, his name looking small and out of place on the crisp white pages. When he was done, Richard smiled, taking the papers and shaking Damien's hand again. "Congratulations, Damien. You're now officially a student at the best school in the city. You've got a bright future ahead of you." Damien tried to smile, but it felt forced. He was still processing everything, still trying to understand what this meant for him, for his family. Richard led him back to the car, giving him a final pat on the back. "We'll get you started next week," Richard said. "You'll have everything you need to succeed. I'll make sure of it." Damien nodded, stepping back into the car. The ride back felt different, heavier. The city slowly gave way to the countryside again, and Damien felt the weight of what had just happened pressing down on him. He had just signed away the next part of his life, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. When he got home, his parents were waiting on the porch, their eyes filled with hope and fear. Damien stepped out of the car, the driver giving him a nod before driving away. His mom rushed forward, her hands on his face. "How did it go?" she asked, her eyes searching his. "It's official," Damien said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm going to the school." His mom smiled, tears filling her eyes. She hugged him tight, and his dad stepped up, putting a hand on Damien's shoulder. "We're proud of you, son," his dad said, his voice rough. "This is the start of something good. I know it." Damien nodded, but inside, he felt a mixture of fear and uncertainty. The city was so different, so far removed from everything he knew. He didn't know if he would fit in, if he would succeed. But as he looked at his parents, their eyes full of pride, he knew he had to try. For them, for his family, for everything they had sacrificed. Damien sat at the kitchen table, staring at the envelope that held his future. His mom was in the corner of the room, cleaning the last bits of mud from a few salvaged pans, while his dad was in the workshop, trying to put some semblance of order back together. Damien could hear the clatter of tools, the occasional frustrated sigh from his father, and he knew the burden they were all carrying. He took a deep breath, the rustle of the envelope loud in the quiet kitchen. His mom glanced over, her eyes weary but full of curiosity. She set down the rag she'd been using and came over, sitting across from him. "Are you going to tell your father?" she asked, her voice soft. Damien nodded, his throat tight. "Yeah, I want to do it now." His mom gave him a small smile, reaching out to touch his hand. "He'll be proud, you know. We both are. Whatever happens, Damien, we're behind you." Damien swallowed, feeling the lump in his throat grow. He nodded, standing up from the table and making his way to the back door. The sunlight was streaming through, and he could see his dad hunched over the workbench, trying to repair a wrench that had rusted overnight from the floodwater. "Dad?" Damien called, stepping out onto the small porch. His dad looked up, his face etched with lines of exhaustion. He gave Damien a tired smile, straightening up slowly. "What is it, son?" Damien stepped closer, holding out the envelope. His dad frowned, wiping his hands on a rag before taking it. He turned it over, his eyes scanning the writing. "What's this?" he asked, looking back up at Damien. It's from Mr. Hargrove, the scholarship papers," Damien said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I signed them yesterday. I'm going to the school in the city." His dad's eyes widened, and he looked back down at the envelope, then back at Damien. "You're serious?" he asked, his voice full of surprise. Damien nodded, Yeah, I know it's a big change, but I think it's the right thing to do. For all of us. His dad was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the envelope. Damien could see the emotions playing across his face. Pride, worry, fear. Finally, his dad nodded, his eyes glistening. "You're a good boy, Damien," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "You've always been a good boy. I'm proud of you, son. This is a chance. A real chance. You go and you make the most of it." Damien felt his chest tighten and he blinked quickly, trying to push back the tears. "Thanks, Dad. I promise. I'll work hard. I'll make you proud." His dad reached out, pulling Damien into a hug. Damien closed his eyes, the weight of everything pressing down on him. But in that moment, he felt lighter. His dad pulled back, giving him a small smile. "Your mom and I will be fine here. You just focus on your studies, okay? Don't worry about us." Damien nodded, though he knew it wouldn't be that easy. He would always worry about them, about the house, about the workshop. But he also knew his dad was right. This was a chance he had to take. They went back inside, and his mom looked up, her eyes filled with hope, as she saw the look on Damien's dad's face. He nodded, and she smiled, tears filling her eyes. "Looks like we've got ourselves a scholar," his dad said, his voice full of pride. Damien blushed, shrugging his shoulders. "I haven't done anything yet." His mom shook her head, coming over and pulling him into a tight hug. "You've done plenty, Damien. You've already made us proud. This is just the beginning." The rest of the day passed in a strange blur. They continued cleaning up, trying to salvage what they could, but there was a sense of hope that hadn't been there before. Damien felt it too, a small flame of excitement mixed with fear. He knew it wouldn't be easy. He knew the city was a world away from everything he knew, and he'd be stepping into a place where he didn't belong, at least not at first. But he also knew he had to try. Later that evening, as the sun began to set, Damien sat on the porch, watching as the last rays of light dipped below the horizon. He heard the door creak open, and his mom stepped out, sitting down beside him. "Are you scared?" she asked, her voice gentle. Damien nodded, his eyes fixed on the distant trees. "Yeah, a little bit." His mom smiled, reaching over and taking his hand. "That's okay, it's normal to be scared. But you're strong, Damien. You've always been strong. Just remember, no matter where you are, we're always here. This is your home, and we're always going to be your family." Damien swallowed, his eyes stinging. He turned to look at her, giving her a small smile. "Thanks, Mom. I'll do my best." She nodded, her eyes glistening. "I know you will. Just remember who you are, Damien. No matter what happens out there, don't forget where you came from." Damien nodded, his heart full. He looked out at the horizon, the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. The future was uncertain, filled with challenges he couldn't predict, but he knew he wasn't alone. He had his family, and that was enough. The next week was a whirlwind. Richard had arranged for everything, new uniforms, books, even a place for Damien to stay during the school week. Damien felt overwhelmed by it all, the newness of everything, the feeling of being pulled out of his old life and thrown into something entirely different. The day before he was set to leave, Damien stood in his room, packing the last of his clothes into a small suitcase. His younger sister, Amelia, stood in the doorway, her face a mix of curiosity and sadness. "Do you have to go, Damien?" she asked, her voice small. Damien turned, giving her a gentle smile. He knelt down, pulling her into a hug. "Yeah, I do, Amelia, but it's not forever. I'll be back every weekend, and I'll call all the time. I promise." She nodded, her arms tight around his neck. "I'm going to miss you." "I'm going to miss you too," Damien said, his voice thick. He pulled back, looking into her eyes. "But you're going to be okay. You're going to help Mom and Dad, right? You're going to be strong for me?" Amelia nodded, her eyes glistening. "I will." Damien smiled, ruffling her hair. "That's my girl." The next morning, Damien stood in front of the house, his suitcase by his side. His parents were there, his mom holding back tears, his dad standing tall, pride in his eyes. Amelia clung to their mom's side, her eyes wide. The black sedan pulled up, the driver stepping out and opening the door. Damien turned to his parents, hugging them both tightly. "I love you," he said, his voice cracking. "We love you too, Damien," his mom whispered. "Go make us proud." His dad nodded, his eyes glistening. "You're going to do great things, son. Just remember to keep your head up." Damien hugged Amelia one last time, then turned and stepped into the car. The door shut, and the car pulled away, the house growing smaller in the rearview mirror. Damien took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it, the beginning of something new, something terrifying, but full of possibility. As the car drove towards the city, Damien looked out the window, watching as the familiar landscape gave way to the unknown. He was scared, but he was also ready. He was ready to see what the future held, ready to take the chance that had been given to him. And whatever happened, he knew he'd always have a home to return to. Damien stood at the entrance of the school, the towering iron gates casting long shadows over the street. His stomach felt like it was tied in knots as he looked up at the large brick building. The words, Riverton Academy, were carved in stone above the doorway, their elegance and sophistication intimidating him more than he thought possible. He felt the pressure of 1,000 eyes, even though no one was looking at him yet. It was his first day, and everything around him felt alien. The driver who had dropped him off gave him a nod and a polite, "Good luck, sir," before driving away, leaving Damien with just his suitcase and his nerves. He took a deep breath, willing himself to take that first step through the gate. The campus beyond looked pristine, with manicured lawns, pathways lined with flowers, and students bustling around, all dressed in crisp uniforms that seemed to fit them like a second skin. Damien glanced down at his own uniform, new but already feeling out of place, and felt the first sting of unease. As Damien walked through the gate, he noticed groups of students huddled together, laughing, talking, all so comfortable in their surroundings. He felt like an outsider. His footsteps echoed in his ears as he approached the main doors. A few students glanced his way, their eyes lingering just long enough to make him feel self-conscious. Damien quickly looked away, focusing on the path ahead. Inside, the hallways were just as polished as the exterior. The walls were lined with portraits of past headmasters and school accomplishments, debating trophies, sports championships, academic awards. Damien walked slowly, taking it all in, trying to push away the fear gnawing at his insides. He clutched his schedule, the paper slightly crumpled from his nervous grip. "Excuse me, are you new here?" a voice called from behind him. Damien turned to see a boy about his age, with neatly combed blonde hair and an easy smile. He wore the same uniform, though it seemed to fit him effortlessly, as if he was born to wear it. Yeah, I'm Damien," he said, his voice coming out a little more strained than he'd intended. "Welcome, Damien. I'm Jonathan," the boy said, extending a hand. Damien shook it, feeling the nervousness ease just slightly. "You look like you could use a guide. First day can be a bit overwhelming, right?" Damien nodded, giving a small, tight-lipped smile. "Yeah, it's a lot." Jonathan chuckled, nodding. "Tell me about it. Come on, I'll show you where everything is." He started walking, and Damien fell in step beside him, grateful to have someone who seemed to know the ropes. As they walked, Jonathan pointed out different rooms and explained the layout of the school, the classrooms, the library, the cafeteria. Damien tried to remember everything, but it felt like a blur. There was too much, and his mind was still reeling from being in a place that felt so foreign. "So, where are you from?" Jonathan asked casually, glancing over at Damien. Damien hesitated, unsure how to explain. I'm from out of town. Small place, nothing like this. Jonathan nodded, giving Damien a sympathetic smile. Yeah, it takes some getting used to, but you'll find your way. Most people here are nice once you get to know them. Damien wasn't so sure. He could feel the glances from other students as they passed, hear the whispers that followed him down the hall. He didn't belong here. He wasn't one of them. But he tried to push those thoughts away, to focus on what Jonathan was saying, on learning his way around. Jonathan stopped in front of a door, nodding towards it. This is your first class, math. Mrs. Peterson is nice, but don't fall behind or she'll ride you for the rest of the semester. Damien nodded, taking a deep breath. Thanks, Jonathan. I appreciate it. No problem, Jonathan said with a smile. I'll see you around, Damien. Good luck. With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowded hallway. Damien watched him go, then turned back to the door. His heart was pounding, and he felt the familiar wave of fear washing over him. But he squared his shoulders, took another deep breath, and pushed the door open. The classroom was bustling with activity, students talking, laughing, settling into their seats. Damien scanned the room, feeling every eye turn to him as he stepped inside. He found an empty seat near the back and made his way there, trying to ignore the whispers that followed him. He could feel his cheeks growing warm, and he kept his eyes down, focusing on getting to his desk without tripping over anything. The teacher, Mrs. Peterson, was at the front, writing something on the board. She turned as Damien sat down, her eyes landing on him. She gave a small smile. "Ah, you must be Damien," she said, her voice kind but carrying easily across the room. "Welcome to math. We're glad to have you here." Damien nodded, mumbling a quick, "Thank you." The class settled down, and Mrs. Peterson began the lesson. Damien tried to focus, but it was hard. The material was different from what he was used to, more advanced, faster paced. He could feel himself falling behind, the numbers on the board blurring together as he tried to keep up. After what felt like an eternity, the bell rang, signaling the end of class. Damien let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, gathering his things as quickly as possible. He wanted to get out of the classroom, away from the curious eyes and the whispers. He felt out of place, lost. He made his way to the next class, then the next, each one feeling more overwhelming than the last. The teachers were kind, but the students weren't. They eyed him, whispered about him, their words just loud enough for him to catch snippets. "Who's the new kid? He looks so out of place. Did you see his shoes?" By the time lunch rolled around, Damien felt exhausted. He stood in the cafeteria, his tray in his hands, scanning the room for a place to sit. The tables were filled with groups of students, all laughing and talking. He didn't see anyone he recognized. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, and made his way to an empty table in the corner, sitting down and keeping his eyes on his tray. He could feel the stares, hear the whispers, but he tried to block them out. He took a bite of his sandwich, though he wasn't hungry. He just wanted the day to be over, to get back to the small room that had been set up for him in the dorms, where he could be alone. "Hey, new kid," a voice said, and Damien looked up to see a boy standing in front of him. He was tall, with dark hair and an expensive-looking watch. He smirked down at Damien, his eyes cold. "What's your name?" the boy asked, his tone mocking. "Damien," he said quietly, his heart pounding. The boy nodded, then looked over his shoulder at his friends, who were standing a few feet away, snickering. He turned back to Damien. "Well, Damien, just a word of advice. You should probably stick to your own kind. You don't belong here." Damien felt his face grow hot, his hands clenching around his tray. He didn't say anything, just looked down at his food, trying to ignore the laughter that followed the boy as he walked away. He could feel tears stinging his eyes, but he blinked them away, refusing to let them fall. He knew this would be hard. He knew it would be different. But knowing it and experiencing it were two very different things. He finished his lunch as quickly as he could, then left the cafeteria, finding a quiet corner in the hallway where he could breathe. He leaned against the wall, closing his eyes and taking deep breaths, trying to calm the storm of emotions inside him. He felt small, out of place, like he was drowning all over again. But then he remembered his mom's words, her voice telling him to remember who he was, where he came from. He thought about his dad, about the way he had looked at Damien with so much pride, and about Amelia, who had hugged him so tightly, asking him not to go. Damien opened his eyes, his breathing steadying. He wasn't here for them, for the kids who didn't understand him or thought he didn't belong. He was here for his family, for his future, and he wasn't going to let anyone take that away from him. He pushed himself off the wall, straightening his uniform and taking a deep breath. He had more classes to get through, more obstacles to face. It wasn't going to be easy, but nothing worth having ever was, and Damien had never backed down from a challenge before. Damien woke up the next morning feeling drained. The events of his first day weighed heavily on his mind. He had barely slept, replaying every glance, every whispered word, every smirk in his head. He sat up in the small, unfamiliar room, his eyes adjusting to the dim morning light streaming through the narrow window. The dorm was quiet, the other boys either still sleeping or getting ready silently. Damien rubbed his face, trying to shake the unease that had settled over him like a heavy blanket. "All right, Damien," he whispered to himself. "You just have to get through today, one day at a time." He dressed in his uniform, smoothing the wrinkles as best he could, and grabbed his books. He felt a pang of homesickness as he thought about his mom. She would have had breakfast waiting for him, probably asking if he had enough sleep. Instead, he stepped out into the sterile hallway, his footsteps echoing off the tile as he made his way down to the cafeteria. The dining hall was busy, students rushing to get breakfast before class. Damien grabbed a tray and scanned the room, trying to find a quiet spot. He spotted Jonathan sitting with a group of students, laughing easily. Jonathan caught Damien's eye, giving him a small wave. Damien nodded back, though he didn't move towards them. He still felt like an outsider, not ready to join in. He found a seat at an empty table, setting down his tray and trying to ignore the chatter around him. He had just started eating when Jonathan appeared beside him, his tray in hand. "Hey, Damien," Jonathan said with a smile. "Mind if I sit?" Damien shrugged, offering a small smile. "Sure." Jonathan sat down, taking a bite of his toast. He looked over at Damien, his eyes full of curiosity. "How's it going? First day's always rough, but it gets better." Damien nodded, though he wasn't entirely convinced. "It's different. Still trying to get used to everything." Jonathan chuckled. "Yeah, I get that. Took me a while to figure it all out too, but hey, if you need anything, just let me know." "Thanks," Damien said quietly, grateful for the offer. He still felt hesitant, unsure if he could trust anyone here, but Jonathan seemed genuine, and for now that was enough. The bell rang, signaling the start of classes, and Jonathan stood up. "I've got history first. You?" "Same," Damien said, glancing at his schedule. "Awesome. Come on, I'll show you where it is." Jonathan gave Damien a friendly pat on the shoulder before leading him through the crowded hallway. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of lessons and textbooks. Damien tried to focus, but it was difficult. The material was advanced, the pace fast, and he felt like he was constantly trying to catch up. Every mistake he made felt magnified, every stumble a reason for someone to whisper or smirk. Still, he pressed on, reminding himself why he was here. At lunchtime, Damien found himself alone again. He chose a corner table, focusing on his food, trying to avoid eye contact with anyone else. He was halfway through his sandwich when he heard a familiar voice. "Hey, Damien," Jonathan called, approaching with his tray. "Mind if I join again?" Damien looked up and nodded, relieved to see at least one friendly face. Jonathan sat down, setting his tray beside Damien's. He was joined by a girl, her dark hair pulled back into a neat ponytail. She gave Damien a curious look. "Hey, this is Emily," Jonathan said, nodding towards the girl. "Emily, this is Damien. He's new here." Emily smiled, offering her hand. "Nice to meet you, Damien." Nice to meet you too," Damien said, shaking her hand. "So, how's it going?" Emily asked, her voice kind. "Jonathan's been telling me you're new here. It can be kind of a lot, right?" Damien nodded, feeling a bit of the tension ease from his shoulders. "Yeah, it's definitely different from what I'm used to." "Well, you're lucky you've got Jonathan showing you around," Emily said with a grin. "He's the nicest guy here." Jonathan rolled his eyes, giving Emily a playful nudge. "Stop making me blush." Damien chuckled, and for the first time since he arrived, he felt a little more at ease. The three of them talked through lunch, Jonathan and Emily filling Damien in on the ins and outs of the school, what teachers were strict, which classes were the hardest, and which spots were best for sneaking away for some peace and quiet. Damien listened, soaking it all in, grateful for the distraction from his own worries. After lunch, they had science together. Jonathan and Emily walked with Damien to the classroom, and they managed to find seats next to each other. The teacher, Mr. Thompson, was older, with glasses perched on his nose and a voice that carried throughout the room. He began explaining the basics of the upcoming lab, and Damien did his best to keep up, scribbling notes as fast as he could. "Hey, Damien," Jonathan whispered, leaning over. "You get all this? It's kind of confusing." Damien shook his head slightly. "No, not really." Jonathan grinned. "No worries. We can go over it together later if you want." Emily leaned in from the other side, nodding. "Yeah, we can help you out. It took me forever to understand Mr. Thompson's way of teaching." Damien looked between them, feeling a warmth in his chest. They were offering to help. Real help. It was something he hadn't expected, and it made him feel like maybe, just maybe, he could make it through this. "Thanks, guys," he said, his voice soft. "I'd really appreciate it." The rest of the class passed quickly, and by the end of it, Damien felt like he'd managed to understand at least some of the material. As they left the classroom, Jonathan and Emily walked beside him, talking easily, making Damien feel like part of their group. "Hey, do you want to come to the library with us after class?" Emily asked as they walked down the hallway. "We're going to study for a bit. It might help you catch up." Damien hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, that sounds good. I could use all the help I can get." Jonathan grinned, giving him a friendly nudge. "That's the spirit. We'll get you caught up in no time." They spent the afternoon in the library, the three of them sitting at a table in the back corner. Jonathan and Emily explained the parts of the lesson Damien hadn't understood, breaking it down in a way that made sense. Damien asked questions, feeling more comfortable with each answer, the knot in his chest loosening as he realized that maybe he could do this. He wasn't alone. By the time the sun began to set, Damien felt exhausted but accomplished. He'd managed to catch up on most of the work, and for the first time since he arrived, he felt like he wasn't drowning. "Thanks, guys," Damien said as they packed up their books. "I really appreciate you helping me." Jonathan waved him off, smiling. "No problem, man. You do the same for us, right?" Emily nodded, giving Damien a reassuring smile. "We're all in this together. Besides, you're pretty cool. It's nice having you around." Damien felt a warmth spread through his chest, and he smiled, a genuine smile. "Thanks. It's nice having friends here." They walked out of the library together, the sky growing dark, the stars beginning to appear. Damien felt a sense of hope he hadn't felt since he arrived. He knew there would still be challenges, still people who would look at him like he didn't belong. But he also knew he had friends now, people who were willing to help, to make him feel like he was part of something. And as he walked back to the dorm, his heart felt lighter. He thought of his family, of his mom and dad and Amelia, and he knew he was doing this for them. But now, he was also doing it for himself. He wasn't just surviving, he was finding his way. The final bell rang, signaling the end of Damien's first week at Riverton Academy. He let out a sigh of relief, leaning back in his chair as the other students packed their books and rushed out of the classroom. It had been a tough week, each day bringing new challenges, both in the classroom and in navigating the unfamiliar social waters of the school. But there had been good moments, too. Damien had found a small sense of belonging, thanks to Jonathan and Emily. And today, as he looked around at the bustling classroom, he didn't feel as much like an outsider anymore. Jonathan appeared beside him, a smile on his face. "Hey, Damien, you heading to the library again? Or do you want to come with us to the quad? Emily and a few others are hanging out." Damien glanced at his schedule, filled with notes and assignments he needed to catch up on. But then he looked at Jonathan, who was waiting with that easy smile, and he realized that there were other kinds of learning here, making friends, feeling a part of something. He smiled and nodded. "Yeah, I'll come to the quad," Damien said, packing up his things. The two of them made their way through the crowded hallway, weaving between students and teachers. Damien noticed a few familiar faces, and a couple of people even nodded or smiled at him. He nodded back, feeling a warmth in his chest. It wasn't perfect, and he still had moments of doubt, but it was getting better. The quad was bustling with activity. Students scattered across the lawn, some studying, some playing games, others just talking and laughing. Emily waved them over, and Damien saw that she wasn't alone. There were a couple of other students he recognized, but hadn't had the chance to speak to yet. "Hey, you made it," Emily said with a smile, patting the empty spot beside her. "Come join us." Damien sat down, Jonathan beside him, and Emily introduced the others. There was Rachel, who was sketching in a small notebook, and Marcus, who was half-heartedly tossing a football back and forth with another boy. They all greeted Damien warmly, and he felt the tension in his shoulders begin to ease. "So, Damien," Marcus said, grinning, "Jonathan tells us you're the hero who saved that guy during the flood. Is that true?" Damien blushed, glancing at Jonathan, who just smiled and shrugged. Yeah, I guess. I didn't really think about it. I just did what I had to do." "That's amazing," Rachel said, her eyes wide with admiration. "I don't know if I could have done that." Damien shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. "It wasn't really a choice. He needed help. I couldn't just leave him." Jonathan patted Damien on the back, smiling. "See, that's what makes you awesome, Damien. You just do what needs to be done." The group fell into easy conversation, talking about their classes, the teachers, and the upcoming school events. Damien listened, sometimes chiming in, sometimes just enjoying the fact that he was there, that he was part of the conversation. He could feel the sun warming his skin, the laughter of the students around him filling the air, and for the first time since arriving at Riverton, he felt like he could breathe freely. They stayed out there for a while, until the sun began to dip low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. As the other students started to leave, Damien looked at Jonathan and Emily, a smile spreading across his face. "Thanks for today, guys," Damien said quietly. "I really needed this." Emily grinned, nudging him playfully. "Anytime. You're one of us now, Damien. We've got your back." Jonathan nodded, his eyes full of sincerity. "She's right. You're not alone here." Damien felt a lump form in his throat and he blinked quickly, trying to keep his emotions in check. He nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. Thanks. They all got up, making their way back to the dorms. Jonathan walked ahead with Marcus, the two of them talking about a football game, while Emily hung back with Damien. "Are you heading home this weekend?" Emily asked as they walked. "Yeah," Damien said, a smile tugging at his lips. "I want to see my family. It's been a long week." Emily nodded. "That's great. I bet they'll be so proud of you." Damien thought about his mom, her eyes full of worry when he'd left, about his dad's firm handshake and the way he'd said, "Keep your head up." He thought about Amelia, her small arms wrapped around his neck as she whispered for him not to go. He missed them all, and he couldn't wait to see them. The next day, Damien found himself standing in front of the school, his small bag packed and slung over his shoulder. The driver that Mr. Hargrove had arranged pulled up, and Damien climbed inside, the car pulling away from the grand buildings of Riverton and heading back towards the familiar landscape of home. He watched as the city slowly gave way to fields and small houses, his heart lifting with each mile that brought him closer to his family. When they finally pulled up in front of his house, Damien felt a rush of emotion. The house looked the same, small, with the roof patched up after the flood, the garden still showing signs of damage. But it was home. He stepped out of the car, his feet crunching on the gravel driveway, and the door flew open. "Damien!" Amelia shouted, running towards him, her small feet pounding on the dirt. Damien dropped his bag, catching her as she jumped into his arms. He hugged her tightly, lifting her off the ground. "Hey, Amelia," he said, his voice thick. "I missed you, kiddo." She pulled back, her face breaking into a wide smile. "I missed you too. Mom and Dad are waiting for you inside. They've been talking about you all week." Damien set her down, ruffling her hair, and picked up his bag. He walked up to the house, Amelia skipping beside him, and stepped inside. His mom was there, her eyes immediately filling with tears as she saw him. "Damien," she whispered, her voice cracking. She rushed forward, wrapping her arms around him. Damien closed his eyes, breathing in the familiar scent of home, his mom's cooking, the faint hint of wood from his dad's workshop. "I'm home, Mom," he said, his voice breaking. His dad stepped into the room, his face breaking into a proud smile. "Look at you, son. You look good." Damien pulled away from his mom, stepping over to his dad and giving him a firm handshake, then a hug. "It's good to be back, Dad." They sat down together in the small kitchen, the table filled with food his mom had cooked, a welcome home meal. They talked, his mom and dad asking questions about the school, about his classes, about his new friends. Damien answered as best as he could, sharing the good moments, leaving out the hard ones. He wanted them to know that he was okay, that he was doing his best. Later that night, after Amelia had gone to bed, Damien sat outside on the porch with his parents. The air was cool, the stars bright above them, and for the first time in a long time, Damien felt at peace. "Are you happy, Damien?" his mom asked, her voice gentle. Damien looked at her, then at his dad, who was watching him with a quiet intensity. He thought about everything, about the fear, the uncertainty, the loneliness. But he also thought about Jonathan and Emily, about the quad, about the way he'd begun to feel like he was part of something. "Yeah, Mom," Damien said, his voice steady. "I think I'm getting there. It's not easy, but it's worth it." His mom smiled, her eyes glistening. "That's all we ever wanted for you, Damien. To find your way, to be happy." His dad nodded, his voice full of pride. "You're doing good, son. Just keep pushing forward. We're always going to be right here." Damien looked out at the horizon, the fields stretching out under the starlit sky. He knew the road ahead was still long, still filled with challenges he couldn't yet see. But he also knew he wasn't alone. He had his family, his friends, and a future that was his to shape. And as he sat there, surrounded by the people who loved him, Damien felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He felt hope.